briefly introduce the panel and then let everybody else speak. So as you've heard, this panel is about storytelling, narratives and fiction. And in particular, today, there is a line of photography and figuring going through the presentation. So there is an extra element to it. And it touches on topics of reclaiming, restoring, reimagining. So narratives have something to do, obviously, with questioning and recreating what might be there already. Our external speaker, which we're very happy to have, is Dora Klove. She is a researcher at the University of Kassel, associated with the research group Gender and Diversity in Informatics Systems. And her work brings together feminist materialism and post-humanities to see how human-computer interaction can be rethought and open up to different epistemological perspectives, and machine learning also comes into this. She has also published already extensively, so it's very nice that she's here with us. And then from the three artists from the Master at Goldsmiths, we have Maite de Orbe, who works in an interdisciplinary space between digital and analog, also with photography and narratives. Our main focus is objectivity, and our objectivity has to be questioned, and has to be questioned at the level of the institutions that retrench objectivity, museums, galleries, medical in some instances, or the very organizational space she's working with. And her idea is, how can we find alternative ways of living and coexisting with the environment we're in? And her exhibition here in Talishan addresses exactly this question. The second artist is James Lawton, to my left. He also works with photography, but in a very different way. He's developed a very interesting experiment where he's using machine learning to create self-portraits. And already there is a sort of interesting tension there, because machine learning obviously develops a certain degree of autonomy. So we see what goes on there. And the problems are perception of self, the narratives, the myth of the self, and the image of the self that is there. And the psychology that goes with this. And then the third artist is Felix Loftus. Felix brings together photography and the narration and the historiation of environment. And what is very interesting in his work is that the relationship between land, food, human and more than human are all tied in with the colonial and post-colonial questions and imperial logics that have somehow organized the environment. And what he's working on at the moment is how these practices of disorientation or deconstruction open up possibilities of rewriting history. So as he calls it, a mix of restoration and historiation, so it becomes rehistoriation. And he works at the moment on a local landfill here to the park, and therefore there are many layers acting at the same time in the work. I need to hear to these. There are questions later on we're going to address.
It's me. Oh, all right. So thank you so much. Thank you also, Yasmin, and the organizers for inviting me. As Matthias said, I'm a PhD candidate in Kassel. I'm also a visiting fellow at the City University of London at the Center for Human-Computer Interaction Design. And so I'm really working in an interdisciplinary way across and through the humanities and informatics, and specifically machine learning, feminist materialism, critical computing, and algorithmic systems design. And what I'm interested in is the epistemic premises of machine learning systems as technologies that do not simply discover, but actively generate knowledge. And I look at how these premises then can be sort of addressed or even intervened into with intersectional feminist perspectives. So my work is, part of it is quite theoretical, looking at machine learning models, and the other part is more pragmatic, sort of orienting towards how do we destabilize processes of systems design with more speculative approaches or just intersectional approaches. So in preparing for this conversation, I was trying to pin down what is my entry point into the topic of storytelling, narratives, and fictioning, and how does it come through in my research. And I guess the main way that it comes in is this concern of how do we re-story computational technologies and infrastructures that we use and that we live within. So I'm interested in what kind of storied matter, to use Jovino's and Oppermann's term, is machine learning and computation. So, for example, even when we work with very simple algorithms such as linear regression, what kind of agencies and histories and backgrounds does it bring forth? And in the case of linear regression, we can think about statistical prediction, but also modeling relations, as well as these eugenic dreams of population management and control, which is the context in which linear regression emerged. So I'm interested in this sort of restorying of computation, of machine learning. And another entry point is the relation to storytelling is the kind of stories that systems generate, whose stories do they center, and through this sort of composing, juxtaposing, bringing together and pulling apart different phenomena, both human and non-human, how do machine learning systems, what kind of stories do they tell? So here I'm interested in finding methodologies how these stories can be told otherwise. So for instance, I'm really interested in working with feminist intersectional theoretical tools that weren't meant to be necessarily design approaches. So for example, I try to ask what happens in systems design if we recenter concepts such as diffraction, critical fabulation, figuration, situated knowledge, and other concepts that come from critical epistemologies. So I'm interested in what kind of different sensibilities and subject positions emerge or can potentially emerge if we do that. So I think my work resonates a lot with all the artists' work here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. So, sure. Okay, thanks. So this piece is called Inside His Mind. It is a reflection on the term of hysteria as kind of a tool that has been used, and there are synonyms that has been used to kind of narrow down the space for like emotional knowledge and situated knowledges. So basically it pays a lot of attention to its meanings and its previous context and how that has developed through time, because it is a very ancient word. And alongside other research that I've done through the year, it ends up being picking on aftermath aesthetics that combines digital and analog. So it's based on physical computing and motors, and it works around how can motors trigger and how can that create an environment. It is based on 5 different pieces that talk to each other, hopefully. It's a sound and photography piece. And all of them kind of like collaborate to express different approaches to what could be reimagined as hysteria and how can it be reappropriated. So through this project, I think I've tried to like decentralize what it could be a system and how like represent the different ways that a system can tell, like the different voices that can collaborate to the same story. So like not giving agency to just one piece in specific. And in that sense, also talk about like a more performative thing of how like a more performative approach to telling stories and a more like back and forth going about them. That's a bit about it.
Thank you. Felix?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. So my work is what I'm calling a visual story about the afterlives of landfill sites in the UK as community gardens and ecological parks. which comprises of computational photography of the sites, live photography of plants taken from those sites, which are kind of plants that are really kind of at the forefront of restoring those sites to being more like livable again. Hypertext piece using an e-ink screen, which is based on historic data of like 19,800 historic landfill sites in the UK. And these kind of individual pieces are contextualized by two kind of short stories I've written about these sites, which connect landfill sites to the Irish mythological stories of immortals and the ASC, which are mythological kind of creatures or like people who live under the hills in Ireland, who are immortal and who and there's like a kind of story structure that my stories have been following, which is kind of the immortal stories where kind of a human will, they were written I think in around 1200, in the stories, like someone from the human domain will kind of fall into one of these hills and they will meet the people up the sea. And then through a process of like going into their world, they'll then come back to the human world with like an altered perspective of the human world. So I thought that would work quite well in relation to landfill sites, which are these kind of new hills that have been created all across the UK. So in my work, I'm imagining that these new kind of landfill sites have created a new branch of like immortals. And kind of my question to my audience is like, what are these new immortals that we've created? What are these new mythological creatures? So I've mainly been doing this through using the camera as a kind of storytelling tool, using some kind of computational vision scripts, using kind of a custom digital camera that I've been developing with a Raspberry Pi. And this has ended up with some photos that have been engraved onto a greenhouse, which is what I'm using as a frame to kind of tell my story. And then the camera is also being used as some kind of a motorized slider to take pictures of these plants, but in a way where they start to kind of expand to fill the room rather than being these kind of small plants, which is what they might look like from a kind of human, or like just with the human eye. Yeah, that's my piece.
Thank you. James?
I'm James Lawton, and my project is basically a self-portrait done by feeding my own photography drawings and writings into machine learning, creating huge data sets with them and training it on that to see what the AI, so to speak, feeds back to me. I guess you could say how it sees me a little bit. In relation to the narrative, there's of course, there's all sorts of stuff involved, whether it's what I feed into it in terms of what I'm choosing, what I'm curating, so to speak, to for it to create with. There's also quite strongly, an implied action by the viewer when they see the images that are output, when they see the text that is output, which is a bit convoluted coming from the AI of sort of reassembling a story of a person or whatever the case may be. And I've related it, quite a bit to the way we see ourselves, the way we see others, and all this other sort of stuff. There's a handful of psychology in it also. And one thing you don't see, for example, in the images displayed, is that there's a large amount of text, and that there's both images and text that are deliberately taken out of the digital context. I was an MFA student, so I had a whole dissertation paper and stuff, and it had a lot to do with how we as humans perceive the images and the text that is generated by artificial intelligence and machine learning. And a lot of it had to do with context. So I printed some images as salt prints, a historical photography printing technique, and I wrote out a lot of the text that was generated by hand It's kind of hard to put up here because you just see the text and you wouldn't have the chance to read it or sort of digest the effect of it as you would in person. But it's a significant part of it that a lot of it was taken out of, you know, this is a digital context and thrown up on a screen, and it's very handwritten analog stuff. I don't have all the cool lights and stuff going on, but it's sort of a different aesthetic for this kind of thing. But there you go. Wait, breathe.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, I don't know how we can proceed. We've been offered some questions to start the conversation, but we may have already comments or questions, or there may be comments or questions coming from our audience. So, is there anything that is urgent or needed to be said? I'll read the questions we have been offered, and then we see. The first one is, who is or are the narrators in these narratives and this storytelling? And then with that, also very interesting, since we have issues of course around the self and the image of the self that is presented, or the person that is presented in your work, in Coda's questioning as well. Can the storytelling be a multi-agent storytelling? Can the notion of self that we have inherited from the history of the West be opened up, not fragmented, but diffused? And it has a lot to do with the notion of distributed intelligence that is being discussed in the present. So it's a very interesting way to approach the notion of storytelling, or better to interpret storytelling in the direction of machine learning algorithms. And with that, can perspective about telling stories can be restructured from multiple angles, which is a different take on this. And then continuing from this, computing as a compositional process, not an instrumental line that has an idea and realizes a result, but a process that has its own materiality. And as Goda was already hinting at when she was speaking of feminist interpretation of materialism and intersectional feminism, there are plenty of elements that concur into the final subject of things. And then going more specifically towards photography, how photography is challenged in its traditional understanding by the new possibilities opened up by computation. It is perhaps more directly addressed to you, but there is also in the work of how you use the paints method, or how you are reconstructing, telling stories through the documentation. So then you're challenging the documentation. And then the last point, that probably holds all these points together, is that there is a performative element into all these forms of working and thinking, whether it is the performing of identities, which is an established concept by now, but also performing the narrative, performing the name and the man has the place. With these open comments.
Is there hit me with one question?
Well, tourism, and I repeat the question I thought of when I was reading your brief biography. Right. You are engaging with machine learning process.
Yeah.
And you are starting off with the idea of a self-portrait.
Right.
But progressively, the machine does something that you control less and less, because it's the machine that does something. So the very notion of self-portraiture captured the question.
Right.
And I thought it was very interesting and intriguing as an open experiment.
Yeah.
It's not a shortcoming.
No, I get what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess there's two ways to say it. I mean, at one point, Rachel, who's one of my tutors, she was asking me, I actually forget exactly how she worded it, which is unfortunate as I'm trying to tell the story, but, she was essentially asking me, if I felt that, I was working with the AI, almost like there was a personification of it, or if it was giving something back to me, so to speak, or whether I felt that it was mine. I mean, certainly certainly I don't have complete control of what it's going to output, which is one of the both beautiful and fascinating things about working with it. I do get hesitant the more I've learned and the more I understand in detail what's going on with it, to really ascribe, to really give it any sort of true agency. I know we talk about it a lot in class, and it's such a fascinating question. But as I read about it, and as I learn about it, and as I work with it and understand what I'm putting in and what I'm getting back, it does seem so mechanistic. I mean, I keep on thinking of the word that comes up a lot in reading things, which is stochastic, right? Which means essentially just random, to simplify things. But it's used a lot in machine learning. It's been used in papers, and it's used a lot in the books when they talk about it. And it's less this sort of intelligent thing that's giving back to me, and it's more that it's taking all these little bits and giving this random thing back. And it can be really interesting and it can be really beautiful, but it seems like the narrative, to bring it back to the subject, that's generated is something that we are ascribing, we are giving to the results. You see the images, and I think of Yishwai, one of my classmates, when he saw from some of the first tests, and there were these images of mountains, and there was these images of the faces and stuff, and he said, I can't help but create a narrative. I see this and I want to create a story out of this, which is, to me, a huge compliment. I thought it was really wonderful. But it seemed to be more him doing it than me feeling like the artificial intelligence was sort of, participating in it or something.
And I didn't begin the comment, but then perhaps you can also say something about it. That's precisely where the interest is in opening up the narrative and the myth of self, as you say, in the sense that the very notion of machine learning has been captured already even before happening as another ready-made separate subject. Is the object becoming the subject? And instead that we are experiencing an entire process where, rather than having an interaction between two poles, we now have an interaction where the participation of various elements with different degrees of, if we want to call it agency, produces identity. Yeah. And the identity only exists within that very precarious balance. And that resonates
Yeah, it just makes me think of how we make meaning more in relating with each other than in these individual kind of objects. Like the meaning comes into your work once people start to kind of describe these stories to, which is really interesting. But I was wondering as well, do you see specific parts that you like of personality that is coming through the model, or is it quite do you see it as a kind of unified?
You mean past, as in, we're going to say a narrative, a personality?
Or is it all kind of unified to you?
Yes, but actually one of the most enjoyable things about the project in the end, and having people view it, is such different responses that people will give to individual images and the thing as a whole. That's actually kind of been rewarding, is, people will take the same image and find it creepy, disgusting, beautiful, peaceful, and then they put them all together, and there's all sorts of stuff. Again, I think if I gave somebody the folder of the images that were generated, and then gave them another folder of another set of images that were generated, especially from a different data set, they might see a personality in that. Having created it, I feel like I'm not being, exciting and interesting when I say this, but having created it and having to put the stuff in there and working with the algorithms and everything, I see them and I go, oh, this is stuff that I put into it, and this is kind of what machine learning did to it. Again, to me, the beautiful part is when I pick some stuff and I put it up on the wall, and then no matter what's going on with me, other people come up and they create something out of that. That's
I think that's very interesting, because it's this thing of human psychology. I feel always tries to build up narratives to understand things. It's this thing that you arrive to a space, and if you don't understand it immediately, you might be scared. Yeah. And I think in that sense, it's very interesting how the spectator will always complete the work in that sense, when they see two things and they immediately want to relate to them, right, or something like that, to empathize.
Right.
And I think it's very interesting. Like, I feel my piece certainly, like, there's a conversation between all the different elements, and there's been a lot of work around how to, like, as I was saying, like, delocalize or decentralize the entire artwork so that it fills out the space. So you enter a space, and therefore you enter a conversation of machines that are talking to each other and are making this noise first, and then this one, and this another one, and having this kind of feeling that it's kind of alive, and making it an entire character, like when you mentioned something about a character of a personality management. I think that's very interesting to achieve.
Yeah, I agree. It's actually one of the rewarding parts about even creating anything is that when other people sort of.
So, you say that in this sense, the distributing the ground of meaning is now a mode of thinking. It does not have to be only related to the specific technologies of computation. So, thinking of your piece, you said something to me that was very interesting. Where many elements in the space, and there weren't different pieces. They were elements that composed the overall feeling on one hand, or they created an atmosphere. And indeed, you called it an orchestra.
Yes.
So it's out of many, there is an emerging unity, and it only happens if everybody's playing at the same time. So it's very delicate and precarious. And in that sense, it made me think while we were speaking that perhaps is just a new paradigm that we are entering, the notion of distribution of agency, which doesn't mean having it and then sharing it, but precisely the opposite.
Yeah, I think that in that sense, and I think the notion of objectivity in photography that I feel the three of us are talking about also comments on that, and like how, I mean, my training as a photographer has been like, well, this is true. Because it happened, because you have a document of it, which is this photograph, which could be completely staged. And there's like stories like people know that like war photography, like pictures have been staged. But since it's there, like it means that it was true. And I think that a lot of our three practices try to like work around different ways of that. So I think in my sense, like what you were mentioning before about this notion of objectivity of, I don't know, in institutions, in history, in like medical science as well. I think my approach in that sense, I'm not sure if it's more of a general thing. I think there is a trend that's starting to try to think in that way, and how like maybe one thing doesn't satisfy to tell everyone's truths, and maybe that the notion of truth is not actually entirely correct, but how actually like a lot of different stories can link to one specific thing, and that can maybe become more truthful to the experience of who went through that. I don't know if that replies to your question.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think like in my piece when I was putting the images on, I wanted to like have them separate from the story so that anyone could kind of like they know that the images are coming from landfill sites, but then maybe not immediately obvious how they relate to landfill sites, which hopefully open the space of possibility for people to like create their own story with the images, and then rather than just take them as they might expect. Like I think and what's kind of helping with that is using kind of computational methods that are interestingly designed to try and make things much clearer, to actually open up more space for imagination when we're looking at kind of, for me, inside kind of the modern human world. But yeah, I quite like that we're kind of using, mostly using tools which were not kind of designed for creative practices or for kind of imagining. They're more for designed for very like specific storytelling. Generally scientific.
If I may pick up also on that objectivity question, the relation between objectivity and subjectivity, here it's as somebody that works with sort of tries to understand how machine learning functions in sort of broader social contexts. There is, however, a discourse that specifically machine learning or a lot of computational technologies allow us to sort of do away with any kind of subject, because we have the data. So we know what you are or what each specific subject is about. We don't need any kind of sort of theory or imaginary of a subject. And what I liked about all of your works is actually that I think, well, it sort of, they play between these two positions of, on the one hand, or the way that I experienced them. On the one hand, they were sort of, for me, highlighting the non-unitary sort of quality of any kind of subject. So I would say, you know, you were mentioning that it's about diffusion of the self, but the self has, I think, never been whole to begin with, and has always been, you know, embedded, embodied, extended, enacted in context. But at the same time, I think when thinking about all of your works, I think if you position it or within this framework of that we might need some sort of subject, particularly when so many have not had a chance to be considered subjects to begin with. So I'm thinking here about any kind of naturalized, racialized, sexualized others. And then in what also, in my experience of all of your works, what comes through is a recomposition of a subject, but on different grounds. So in your work, it is you know, connecting to specific histories and how you know, those also affected real people, but without trying to wrap it up in this one neat narrative, be it scientific or be it purely emotional, psychological, but more sort of also the way it's distributed in space is much more sort of relational for me. That's how I experienced it. And I think with yours, it's also bringing the non-human and the mythological into that sort of as a site of subject formation. So, and
it's also very interesting when you're saying that there's this distribution of subjects. So actually, so it was that wow, it's the narration presented as well. I was thinking about the work of Catherine Behar, Personalities Without People. If you're not familiar with it, Catherine Behar is an artist from Canada who works on as a computational artist, and she wrote a small paper, a small text, where she analyzed what happened with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, and how she moves from intersectional feminism. This is very interesting because she analyzes how the very idea of a subject that emerges, or self, or an identity that emerges out of relations, of the plurality of element that varies, has been completely hijacked by the algorithm and made a mold. So as we said, we have the data, we don't need you anymore. In fact, now you have to comply with your data. And we've seen Brexit, the American election of Trump beforehand, and plenty of other continued manipulation of democracy happened precisely because of it. So it's a very interesting concept that perhaps now the possibilities of computation on the algorithm are re-historiating, or anyway deterritorializing even that emancipatory gesture or approach that wanted to say the subject is never been one, because now you can be captured again as a multiple and still exploited.
Yeah. I've been thinking similar, but in terms of how we image kind of environment and one human, is even kind of ongoing today. Is that as a kind of really strong overlap in kind of carceral technologies and surveillance technologies with kind of conservation technologies, with the technologies that we're developing to understand the modern human have been kind of taken from these kind of surveillance technologies, and now they're being pointed towards kind of animals and other species. And been trying to think through like how that kind of overlapping in technological development reflects on that kind of idea of these species once you start to image kind of them and kind of imagine them through these images.
Indeed, yes, there are a lot of ethical questions that emerge when they move to embrace the critique of anthropocentrism and the Anthropocene, then become an invasion as observation sensors with cameras of precisely that word we would like not to colonize anymore. And it's an open question, right? That would be silly to look for conclusions straight away.
I think the importance of, like, I guess, storytelling And like fictional storytelling or speculative storytelling in that sense is to reimagine all the possibilities outside that like one use of like technology that we've known until now, or what we were like what you were mentioning before, Goda, like how to like bring in all this other into like the norm, or actually just rejecting the norm and then just like imagining all the possibilities outside of that. And I agree with you. I don't think there's like an answer to that, and I won't even try. But I do think that the importance of like storytelling, especially in this context, and as well like what Felix was saying before, like using this technology and recontextualizing it for this other different purpose, it's like a very important exercise, I feel, to like not fall into that and to also like imagine, I guess, like to make possible future and better ways of living and relating to both each other and the environment.
Regarding this, specifically about your work, the installation here, which concerns Hysteria. Hysteria has been, is somehow the prototype of framing something that through a specific image and capturing it. And it has been criticized a lot, but there was an entire institution, an entire use of photography to document it, that somehow generated the image and made people combine it. So it's very interesting that they're re-narrating or reframing that story from multiple angles, I seem to say, is what is necessary, closing it down to one explanation.
Yeah, I think in that sense, like, at least my original intention was, and during the entire year has been like, how can we occupy spaces in different ways? And narrative, of course, comes into this because you decide the way that you want to occupy the space. But I think with Hysteria, it honestly just came from a necessity to talk about that and to raise that conversation and to make people think like maybe Hysteria is not used that much right now, but like synonyms are constantly being used to like narrow down the space that someone's willing to take. And that essentially just blocks all the things that we're trying to talk about. So like, if for instance you try to think differently, or like you react emotionally to something because it comes closer to your truth and you block it immediately with one word, then we cannot go forward in all of these kind of things that we're talking about of like, yeah, like reimagining, I guess.
Good. Does this? I was reading some of your papers, and you speak a lot about the use of figuration with reference to information systems and algorithms. And I wonder if the idea of not closing something down with one narration as a movement.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for reading some of the papers. I feel very flattered. Yes, I think figuration, for me, figuration is, the way I take this up is coming from feminist historiography, feminist theory, and sort of weaving or sort of composing or layering of figurations as a way to explore these otherwise sides of subjectivity. So it's both a sort of you know, a way to use it as an analytic tool almost to understand, you know, if we take something as a figuration, what comes into it, what is it actually made of, what kind of things does it figure and how, and at the same time it's almost programmatic in a sense that it does bring some sort of directions for politics, for thought with it. So I don't know, like the classic figuration of the cyborg is, you know, on the one hand it allows to understand this sort of complex relations of domination with regards to technology and global distribution of power, but at the same time it also proposes almost an ethics of non-unity and sort of living with complexity. So I think I definitely relate, and also actually to all of your work through that concept of figuration building. And I guess in my own work, figurations are on a very pragmatic level one can think of the system as a figuration, and sort of I investigate then machine learning systems as figurations or models as figurations, or it's also a way to rethink the user, so to say, which is an important concept in systems design as a.
You concentrate on the notion of user as extremely reductive.
Yeah, it absolutely is, because not only it is kind of faceless, nameless, disembodied, floating somewhere, could be attached to anything, but it's also, it masks this position of a universal, which it never can be. Nobody is a universal user. Nobody should be.
Are there attempts or functioning examples of systems that try to break away from universal?
You're asking in computer science specifically. Yes, there has been. I'm definitely not the first one to point out the reductiveness of the term user. In the discipline itself, there are people that are trying to rethink the user, and not only as a human user, but also more than human design in interactive systems design is quite an important field by now as well. So I would say yes, absolutely.
It occurs to me is not computational, but it plays between modern human and the notion of the non-universal user. There's a novel by a science fiction writer, the 50th surgeon, titled Modern Human, which goes through a number of sceneries. They are not directly related to each other, but there is one where a number of people, which all have different kind of what we call probably learning difficulties, together they function as a much stronger unit than the computational classical normal individual. And it's a very interesting combination there, because it somehow brings together the idea that what has presents itself with the face of the self, of the subject, is asymmetric. It's got the face that is composite and is fluid and is also composed of elements that were not seen as whole. And they have superpowers, it's science fiction, so it's not superheroes. It's a very interesting idea, because the superhuman, it works as a concept, and then computation gives it more possibilities to be developed. It seemed to me that it just not now, it was already around.
Well, but also, if I connect to Felix's work and Jim's work, so not only not only that subjects can be composite, but also it begs the question: how do we sort of acknowledge is there a sort of other kind of subject emerging, like some kind of hybrid subject in, for example, in your work, when we think what kind of role do mythologies play, or how we so intimately relate to our technologies that we can't just consider that they are reflecting us, they are sort of really diffracting us in a way. So, and that does not make us insufficient somehow, but it does make us very relational and very sort of open and convergent.
I was actually just thinking, I like you describing it as diffracted, and I'm like, I should have put that in my description. Yeah, I don't know, I agree with that. Like, it literally just kind of stopped me. I thought, oh, that's a good, yeah, sorry, that's not a good answer to that, but you just paused me. That's a good description of the way it works, because I had been using the word reflect, like it reflects back to me. But you're right, that's not actually probably the best word. I don't know if that's good. I'm sorry. I might hand it back to Felix on that one. I was just like, oh wow.
Yeah, I think there might be some definitely thinking about how we can like make humanness through stories and like through a kind of consistent revisal of the stories that we tell. But for me, it's particularly like of how we relate to land and how maybe in the current moment we might immediately be lacking kind of stories about the land, but actually how when we start to draw and kind of past like history, we find that there's so many kind of stories that we can draw and start to like revise and then kind of reinforce our like shared humanness through drawing on these historical stories. But also I was quite interested in drawing on historical stories because quite often when you take people back to thinking about like kind of Neolithic times or like multiple thousand years into the past, like people's imagination in terms of what humans could be kind of expands quite a lot. And I think it's quite similar with how kind of speculative writers are working with thinking about the future, because it's like non-determined. It opens this like really incredible imaginative space where people can start to rethink what it is to be human in a way that when you come back to like where you are right now, there's a lot more, see yourself in a lot of different ways. So.
I just, if I may, a comment, I also found it really interesting how the way that you work with land, it just made me think about a lot of indigenous cosmologies, but of course, people that actually engage with indigenous cosmologies who are indigenous themselves, I heard them quite often say that everybody has a connection to the land. You don't need to, only think about the indigenous populations as the ones that have the connection to the land. You just need to really figure out what is your connection to it.
Yeah, and I've always think about what it means to have like our main connection to land be through like a layer of concrete and through a layer of like kind of electrical wires and tubing, like how that might get refigured out or something. But yeah, I think that definitely are, like even looking into English kind of histories, there's lots of different ways people have understood like themselves through how they relate to what is in their area. And I think that kind of connects up with food, especially like how you understand yourself through what kind of may grow around you as well. But then we've got this kind of new kind of distributed version of that where we have foodways from all over.
Regarding the issue of the land and the picturing of the land, which is obviously very different configuration, the image projected onto it, which you mentioned, the invention of the mountain landscape, the picturesque, is all part of the invention of the countryside, is all part of the British heritage. Your work on mountain photographs, where you progressively go from real images to elaborated images, machine learning.
Right.
Is that? Do you see any point of contact or any or not contact?
Some, but I think the I want to be careful because I could probably say something that would connect it and it would sound really great. But to be honest, on a personal level, the mountains for me and the reason they were in there were twofold. They were personal to me for a bunch of reasons. I won't go too far into it on here, but I spent a lot of time outside. I was born near mountains and all this other sort of stuff. I like being in them. I just have a lot of dreams about mountains too. But also, there was a really practical aspect too in the early training experiments that shape is very easy for the machine learning to grab a hold of. And then a lot of the images went in there because they were early experiments. I had those thousands of images on hand that were mine. I didn't need permission, I didn't need to scrape. I just grabbed them and put them in. So it was both a practical and a very personal reason, and I want to be careful not to, add on a layer that's not there that connects it directly. Because what Felix is saying is much more complex than that.
But what I was thinking here is because you started off between computation some documenting photographs, so the traditional understanding of photographs,
right.
And then you fed those images through the machine learning, and the machine started producing its own versions of that landscape. It seemed to me that precisely what was being discussed earlier was presenting itself here again. So the image of the land, not the original narration, but whichever narration was in place when you took the image. And obviously there is a lot of narrative built into the technology of the camera itself.
Sure.
That is, as you were saying earlier, repeated by the machine learning.
Right.
So somehow the layer of concrete you mentioned between you and the land can also be the immaterial layer that the algorithm just repeats because this is what we told it and this is what it does.
Right. No, and it definitely does. I mean, doing the repeating for better or for worse, I can easily tell the the machine, say it that way, you know, give me 500 or give me 1,000 images and stuff, and what you see are things that I might choose for one reason or another, which has its own issues of, you know, bias and curation and all these other sorts of things involved in it. But if you just took the folder and saw the thousands of images, there's, you know, repeats and mistakes and all sorts of, or what I would consider, it's even weird that I even use that word mistake, right? Curious that that came out of my mouth. But I see them, and for one reason or another, you know, you choose, and so there's unquestionably that layer of it doing something that's similar to the concrete. How does that affect us and everything else? Yeah, I mean, I'm really just sort of repeating what you said, but
it makes me think of the word like composition and decomposition, and how they like interrelate, and how composition is like a kind of artistic bringing together of things into like a unified whole. And while your work, like you're making compositions, but you're also kind of consistently decomposing this idea of the self, right, that was maybe there beforehand. But yeah, I quite like about that as well with the, it's got like a simultaneous like analogy with like biological processes, in that like when decomposition of things helps to make new things, right? Like when you're kind of breaking things apart to build up again,
right,
from like things that have been fractured and then brought.
That's an interesting thought too. Just because I'm thinking about the actual process of the way the machine learning works, and it breaks it down into those little bits, and it's understanding the little bits of the images that it's reading, and then create something new. It's a very good thought.
But can these, this is going across what has been said now, can these composition that's made out of broken down elements, the data that gathered from us, which has often been organized into one, a technical term, territorialization, that is one organization of the event of sense, political, human, epistemological that we have. Can it be addressed, can it be deterritorialized? How do we do that? How do we, your work somehow go in this direction already, but I think it's interesting now to see how the compositional element becomes key to this reframing and re-narrating of histories. Without understanding, without taking, not without understanding, but without keeping this in clear view, one risks somehow speaking about the problem from outside. Wishing that a new story could be told, but then never really grasping where. And this is why your approach about from computational intelligence is very, very important and very interesting. Please.
Thank you all for your talks. I had a question about truth and knowledge, and in all your works you draw from and give validity to different sources of knowledge. So Maite, you give validity to emotional knowledge, Felix from the world of myths, and Yoda from embodied experience. I wanted to ask each of you, do you acknowledge that there is an epistemic hierarchy in your work, or do you treat all sources of knowledge as valid and equal?
Very interesting. Was it audible on the recording? So is there epistemic hierarchy in the knowledge that's used, or you approach them as equal?
I think my general epistemic position is definitely that there's multiple knowledges and not like one centralized knowledge. But I think in terms of my work, yeah, I was hoping that the kind of truths would not just be made by me. Like I'm not trying to kind of like preach some specific truth about these areas for everyone, but I wanted to leave it open for people are kind of reading the stories to create their own truths with the story. And it's more like, yeah, guiding people to be able to make their own truths with work, not creating this hierarchy of like, this is the truth that you need to like understand. Does that make sense? Does that echo with yours?
Yeah, I think like, yeah, I want to support that all forms of truth and knowledge are valuable, and actually, like, I think the interesting thing is how they can support each other. I think in this specific piece, it does kind of like specifically create space for emotional knowledge, because also the piece comes from, the origin of this piece was going to be to talk about the contraceptive pill and its evolution, and the way it affects menstruating bodies, and how the knowledge that's transmitted through those menstruating bodies that may be affected by the contraceptive pill has been more from word to word than actually like as a reference of like medical science, for example. So I think it does certainly come from that background, and therefore it challenges, I guess, like scientific, medical science and scientific objective knowledge. But it's more an invitation to take that on board than actually just like reject the other as well. But it does 100% focus on that.
For me, I would say I think the ideal is to not have the, I guess you use the word hierarchical there, but I don't know. I almost want to say it kind of ends up being there anyway. I mean, as much as even in my work, I like the idea that people are creating a narrative. I like that people get the different things out of it. There's the invitation on the piece in person that you can write or draw. You can participate even in the description. It's asking people to literally participate in the work. But I also, you can get, or I can get kind of self-critical in the fact that it's inescapably me creating the images, creating the text, deciding what goes in, choosing what I take out of the output, choosing what I put up, the conversations that I have with people about how they interact. I mean, it's not, entirely as ideally, distributed, so to speak, perhaps as it should be. I mean, that's the ideal, and I think it's more beautiful the closer it is to that. But there's part of me that always sees that little bit of, I have some control over what's going on with that, don't I? And so would other people who are creating other pieces, arguably.
Thank you for the question. I think, well, as a person who is doing a PhD, there are definitely hierarchies. The kind of struggle that I have to go through to argue why I'm using a thing as a method that doesn't have references to it as a method. Don't get me started on that. So yes, there's definitely hierarchies there in that sense. However, I think academia generally is a very hierarchized space, right? But I think what I'm trying to do is perhaps sort of think about positioning. So where do I position myself? And part of that positioning is sort of inescapable. Part of it is about, where I am in the world, how I am read, and what kind of context I have. But the other part is also positioning in a sense of that I consciously sort of choose certain perspectives rather than others. And that for me is a sort of, broadly speaking, political choice and sort of ethical choice. So but that I wouldn't call a hierarchy. I would call it taking accountability. So taking account of the sort of the perspectives that I come from.
Much better again than I did. It's very similar, but much better wording.
I also think that when raising questions about hierarchies in these examples, it's very interesting to think that the use of photography expresses an epistemological hierarchy because it uses vision, which is has always been seen as the most important of the senses, and has always been used as a metaphor for knowledge. So questioning how photography works in this environment becomes very interesting, and here computation opens up even more lines of questioning. But it's very important because obviously how can you hold photography, art, and vision accountable as you so it's a very interesting question to develop.
Yeah, I think in that sense, like my work was mainly driven on what images that are not necessarily photographic can I generate in order to create an impact on the viewer. Like there's a really strong aesthetical decisions in the entire composition of the piece because of what you said. How can I, if it's going to be the main source of knowledge, or if it's going to be taken more seriously, how can I reimagine this without just a photograph, but more of the installation?
Yeah, I think I was also thinking about this question through my work. I guess it's part of photography at the moment is kind of through, or probably continuously is going through a self-reflective phase. But I quite like that through this camera I could make images that look quite mythical and look maybe my reference points were mostly stone carvings from Neolithic burial grounds and stuff, because I wanted to use something which we see as the pinnacle for truth making to create something that we actually find it difficult to create really hard, strong epistemic positions on, because so far in the past we don't have these ideas. So I wanted to use photography to,
But don't get me wrong, I don't say that photography should not be used. If someone started to really find it exciting, then one plays with it. But then one has to realize that one has to play also with its epistemical position, epistemological position in the scale of technology. It's a great question, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I have a question of James, I just sort of love to have some questions regarding that sort of third stage. You said you train the algorithm to repeat back these images, and you take them, you choose which ones are those images. I was wondering if you have a particular aesthetic alphabet that you're using, because your work resonates with Francis Bacon and James Savile. I just feel like you're towing the line between beauty and demonic in a lot of your pieces.
Right, yeah. It's interesting, in the very first rounds of doing the work, especially the black and white, because I was skipping the color for a little bit and trying to work as simple as I could with the results it was given. They were very Francis Bacon. A lot of people were like, oh my gosh, it looks like monsters, or it looks like this or that. And I found it really, really interesting. But I also have to confess that wasn't the result that I wanted. And I'm very deliberately saying that because I know it's a conscious and significant aspect to what you're deciding to put up and the way people get stuff. And one of the things that I was playing with, and some of this again goes back to the dissertation paper and other things, I wasn't necessarily going for the look, I did a machine learning and it looks weird, which I immediately think of, because it was pointed out to me as soon as I started producing these, Mary Klingman, if you're familiar with him and the stuff that he's done. And as soon as it was pointed out that it was similar, I started digging through all his stuff and read all the interview and actually trying to create a separation. Oh my gosh, this is very similar. And then as I was reading through it and I was looking at everything they did, no, there's a different sort of thing that I'm thinking about and looking for. And so I have a background with illustration and with photography and other stuff. And if you look at a lot of the images, and unprovoked, people have said they have almost an illustrative quality to them, and they don't look like just the sort of deformed or messed up face, and there's other things going on. So some of my curation of it moved in that direction. Again, for better or for worse, some people might prefer that sort of Mario Klingman look or the other things going on. But I had seen that, and we had discussed that. We talked about, you said, I've seen this aspect, but not this aspect of some of the stuff. But there was that. There wasn't something really conscious. It wasn't something like, I want something that's beautiful, or I want this, that, or the other. There needed to be something about the images that you responded to. But there was definitely a curation, and there was definitely a move away from I mean, and some of those monstrous ones are still up there. I didn't exclude them, but I didn't want that to be the portrait that was created, whether that's for personal subjective reasons, like I don't see myself or want other people to see myself that way, or that I just didn't want it to look like some of the stuff that had already been created. I didn't want to play off of Francis Bacon. I didn't want to play off of Mary Clement. It's my own sort of portrait.
Absolutely. So when you do the charcoal drawing, are you then doing the drawing based on?
Good question. Thank you. There's stuff that where drawings were fed in, and then later, similar to the prints that were made on historical methods and the handwriting, there were instances where there's drawings and other things. It's almost reversing the process, where the machine gives me an image and then I go, okay, well now I'm going to create something off of that. And people have said it's sort of like working with the AI. And that's where, again, I'm sort of saying I'm a bit hesitant with that, only because I'm being really skeptical, because I know everything that's going on the back end. I've taken the time to, read about it and learn about it. But it's almost a charming little thing to say, oh, you collaborated with the AI to draw these illustrations. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other question or comment? Answer to the answer. Well, I think which was all very interesting to hear, especially because there were so many different angles. I think that what seems to come to the fore as a problem to take away is that the relationship between technology and agency, which already had been turned on its head by classic materialism. Especially I'm thinking here of the historical essay of Walter Benjamin about mechanical reproducibility, where it makes very clear that photography and cinema will never produce the same kind of work and the same kind of artist and the same kind of public that painting and sculpture produce, because they function according to different logics. They exist in multiples. Now here we have yet a new technology that has the ability not so much to exist in multiples, but to break us down into data, and that intersection, how that data can be then figured, or instead captured into a fixed image, remaining in the visual photographic element, is a very important question to ask. So there is an age of not of mechanical reproducibility, but of information, translation, data, into database. And now the system will be, which is what you're starting with.
Do you want me to comment?
Well, if you like, you have something to say.
Well, on agency, right? I think it's a really, when I think about individual agency in the context of modern technologies, there's this great concept, which I'm sure you know, by Gilles Deleuze, individual.
Mm-hmm.
So we are not individuals, we are individuals in a contemporary technological condition. And I think that also does something to the understanding of agency, which is also becoming a much more distributed, subject to appropriation and exploitation, mm-hmm. obviously, with, content production, so to say, for instance, that we all perform constantly by just using the devices. But I think, one of the responses to it that you can also see on a political level is a kind of, let's come back to the one, let's come back to some sort of clear principles that, define what is an agency, and that's also important, but I think there's no way to come back to the individual, really.
Absolutely.
And I'm really therefore interested in how do we then learn to live as individuals, and with the downsides of that, but also with the possible sort of openings that provides.
And in fact, I think that a very present example of what it means to be individuals now is how GDPR was the General Data Protection Agreement in Europe works, and the new one that Britain will come up with next, because it's divergent for them. Because what is very interesting is that information, data is always already there, and it's metadata that now expresses the law. These or that set of data cannot be accessed. So now thinking how the law and metadata coincide, then may have a reflection on the individuality of the present. So it's something that I started thinking of recently, because the idea that information is always already there is not new again, is a concept that Bergson introduced about perception of reality at the end of the 19th century. When he was speaking about hypnosis, the person under hypnosis, according to his analysis, was able to perceive nearly everything, but then the awake, aware state only retained a small portion. And this was not for lack of ground, it was just because it was then packaged in something. And the link then you pass it on is that, look, the same is happening with data. The data of your phone use is stored by the phone company, but the law says that this information cannot be accessed. That's what the metadata now can cut it off, access it off the police or the insurance company. So it's a very interesting way to start thinking which form of individuality these technologies are presenting us with. Please.
I may go again. I wanted to maybe offer a challenge to Mattia after you said how revered visual representations were. I've got a quote by the visual culture theorist Nicholas Menzel, who says, "Western culture has consistently privileged the spoken word as the highest form of intellectual practice and seen visual representations as second-rate illustrations of ideas." And I wanted to ask, in your works, do you see that way, or do you have a reverence specifically for visual representation?
It's interesting because I think, I mean, definitely with mine, with all of us, we've got the both in there. I don't know that I have an answer. I don't even know why I started speaking first, but yeah, that's, I don't know which I would, I mean, some of the reading I did for this was some of the older Marshall McLuhan stuff, so not, I mean, the medium is the message, but going back to the Gutenberg Galaxy and all that, and it was, he was going through all this stuff about how the way that writing and language evolved subsequently changed the visual world and all this other sort of stuff. You know, from the sounds to the pictorial representations of words and sounds, and then those became abstract, and letters no longer the pictures of things. And then, according to him, as you know, the whole thing went through scholastic writing in the Middle Ages and all sorts of other stuff. It changed it. So from that point of view, they're interwoven. Of course, they rely deeply on each other, and there's not, in that case, a hierarchy of which one is more important or not. And I think I immediately perhaps think of that and say it not because that's a good answer. Perhaps, you know, some of my fellow panelists would challenge it, but I immediately just think of that because in my work, it wasn't like it needs to be the image or it needs to be the word. For me, it was, they were very much meshed together, and that's what creates the narrative. For me, helps to create the narrative with the viewer. It's very different not having the text there. It's very different having the text and not the images, or not the mix of images. So I wouldn't, but others might disagree quite strongly.
Yeah, I don't think I want to like set out a hierarchy between those two forms of like visual storytelling through words. I think, yeah, my work is more thinking about how images, or just starting from the premise that images definitely do construct our ideas of reality, and when there's specific genres of images that are dominant, and when they're burdened with like the political weight that they are specifically kind of images that like I'm thinking about environment, and like as you mentioned, kind of images of landscape, which are kind of one of the dominant modes of like imaging environment throughout like kind of the aftermath of colonial imperial times, how they create a specific idea of environment for anyone kind of living in those times. So it's kind of, yeah, I'm more thinking that it's based on that kind of reality. There's a need for new forms of images.
I think I just realized that I made an entire visual piece around a word. I don't know what is more important here. And I think, yeah, I'm not sure what to choose. I think definitely, and from a photographic practice that I do professionally, representation is key, because representation will normalize things, and whatever you decide to normalize, that is super powerful, and that will like have a very strong social impact. But at the same time, that also like reinforces the dialogues that you have in your head, and how you would define certain images, and what like adjectives, or how you would like, I don't know, address them. So yeah, I have no idea. Sorry, I think both one doesn't exist without the other, I would say. Or at least in the specific context that I come from. But I think that definitely like being careful with how you present things visually is really important, but using the specific and right words that I like 100% will change how people think about things as well. Yeah, I don't know.
I can say just, I mean, because I don't have an artistic practice, what I am interested in when it comes to, you know, vision and spoken word is how often impoverished our understandings might be, that we sort of embrace of what is vision, and you know that the fact that vision is sort of understood as this representation or symbol for scientific knowing. You know, vision, first of all, we're only talking about the human vision. And when we realize that, then we realize that vision is profoundly embodied. It has so much to do with sort of other like body motility and proprioception, and how that would be completely different if we had different bodies. And it is different for people who have different types of bodies. So I'm curious in how, whichever sort of mode do we think through, how do we complicate what that mode even means? Same with spoken word, for example. There's a sort of a spoken word as a logical argument of, you know, presenting something, or sort of the word, the sort of performative word of, you know, the deity that then promises you the world. Don't mention the specific histories here. But also spoken word in a kind of oral storytelling tradition that is non-linear, and that is much richer than, I think, the sort of maybe classic spoken word idea as a sort of expression of a dominant cultural formation, if that makes sense.
Brilliant set of answers. I was hearing a different question of what you asked. So to me, you were asking, isn't there in fact a dominance of the spoken word, or the rationality expressed by the spoken word, versus the sense of sight in the tradition? I think as an objective, it is correct. The reason why I mentioned vision earlier, or the way in which I mentioned vision earlier, is because it becomes a metaphor for knowledge. So knowledge is represented through the prism of vision. From the famous myth of the cave of Plato, where the people are at the bottom of the cave looking down and seeing shadows, illusions, and they have to get outside to the light of reason. The metaphor has remained, and has informed all ontological reasoning And all those generations up to the present, and now they're coming under attack precisely because there are different narratives, or there is an attempt to undo the existing narrative, have been shaped around the human able body. So what we pointed out is essential. Different forms of sight already would open up different ways of thinking the logic of knowledge, the way thinking knowledge, thinking space, thinking society, because everything has been constructed as a line between a viewing subject and a viewed object. And undoing this, to me, especially the sense of photography, is an essential aspect for rewriting history. There is, in fact, I never remember the name, I apologize for this because it's bad practice to mention something without being able to reference it. But there was an artist some 10 years ago designed a camera that doesn't have a lens, but crawls the web when you press the shutter and gathers all the images tagged with that moment. And it is one very interesting step in the direction of questioning what does it mean to structure technology upon a certain metaphor of knowledge. I apologize for not running. Nothing else? Well, then, thank you very much to both for coming to us and for your contributions as well. And also, it helped a lot expanding on your pieces in the exhibition. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the attention for everybody else who is following us live or will watch us later on. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Martin.
Sure.